My wife wanted to be the surrogate for her rich boss. I warned her not do it, but she did it anyway, saying, "It's my body, my choice." Now she and her family is begging me. But I am clear, not my baby, not my problem. Let me tell you how my entire world got flipped like a goddamn pancake on a Tuesday night in October. My name's Grant Walker, and up until that moment, I thought I had a pretty decent handle on my life. Sure, the mortgage was kicking my ass. The kids were driving me nuts with their constant need for new sneakers that cost more than my first car, and my job at the accounting firm wasn't exactly setting my soul on fire. But hey, that's middle-class America for you, right? We're all just treading water, hoping we don't drown before retirement. I was sprawled on our beat-up leather couch, the one we'd bought from a garage sale 3 years ago because we couldn't afford the fancy sectional Melissa had been eyeing at Pottery Barn, flipping through Netflix like it was my part-time job. You know how it is. Scroll for 20 minutes, watch nothing, repeat until bedtime. The kids were finally asleep after what felt like a 3-hour negotiation about why they couldn't have ice cream for dinner, and for once, the house was quiet enough that I could actually hear myself think. Melissa walked into the living room with that weird smile she gets when she's about to tell me she bought something expensive without asking. You married folks know the look. It's somewhere between "please don't be mad" and "I'm about to ruin your day." She plopped down next to me, which should have been my first red flag because usually she sits on the opposite end of the couch scrolling through her phone, liking Instagram posts of her high school friends pretending their lives are perfect. "So," she said, and that's when I knew I was screwed. Nobody starts a conversation with "so" when they're about to tell you something good. "So" is the opening act for bad news. "So" is what comes right before the car needs new brakes or your mother's coming to stay for a month. I muted the TV, some crime show where they solve murders in exactly 42 minutes, which is about as realistic as my chances of ever owning a boat, and turned to look at her. "What's up, babe?" I asked, because despite being married for 8 years, I still hadn't learned to just keep my mouth shut and pretend to be asleep. That's when she dropped it. Just like that. No warning, no build-up, no, "Honey, we need to talk." She just looked at me with those big brown eyes that had gotten me into this mess in the first place and said, "I'm going to be a surrogate for my boss, Mr. Whitmore." I swear to God, time stopped. You know that moment in movies when everything goes silent and the camera zooms in on the protagonist's face? That was me, except instead of dramatic music, all I could hear was the neighbor's dog barking at absolutely nothing, like dogs do when they want to remind you that life is chaos. At first, I laughed. I actually laughed. Because what else do you do when your wife tells you she's planning to carry another man's baby, like she's announcing she's thinking about taking up yoga? "Good one, Mel," I said, reaching for the remote. "What are we watching?" But she didn't laugh back. She just sat there with that serious expression she usually reserves for parent-teacher conferences and conversations about our credit card debt. That's when it hit me. She wasn't joking. This wasn't some weird attempt at humor. My wife, the mother of my 3 children, the woman who complained when I left dishes in the sink overnight, was seriously telling me she wanted to get knocked up by her boss. "Melissa," I said slowly, like I was talking to one of our kids after they'd done something spectacularly stupid, "please tell me you're kidding." She shook her head, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. You know that feeling when you're on a roller coaster and you hit the big drop? That moment when your brain catches up to what's happening and realizes you're completely screwed? Yeah, that. "His wife can't have children," she continued, like this was a perfectly normal conversation. "They've been trying for years. Vivian's had 3 miscarriages, and the doctors say it's not safe for her to keep trying. Charles asked me last week if I'd consider it, and I've been thinking about it ever since." Charles. She called him Charles, not Mr. Whitmore. When had that started? And more importantly, when had my wife started having private conversations with her boss about his reproductive plans? "Melissa, no." The words came out sharper than I intended, but hell, she'd just told me she wanted to carry another man's child. I think a little sharpness was warranted. This isn't some small favor. This isn't like watching their dog while they go on vacation. This will destroy us. She rolled her eyes, like I was being dramatic. "Grant, it's not like I'm having an affair. It's a medical procedure. I'm helping them have a family. You're helping yourself have a closer relationship with your boss?" I shot back, because let's be real here. Melissa had always been a little too eager to please authority figures, a little too concerned with what people thought of her. In high school, she was the girl who stayed after class to wash the chalkboards. In college, she was the one organizing study groups for professors who probably didn't even know her name. And now, at 32, she was offering to carry her boss's baby because she thought it would make her indispensable. "That's not what this is about," she said. But her voice had that defensive edge that told me I'd hit the nail on the head. "Charles and Vivian are good people. They deserve to have a family." "What about our family?" I asked, gesturing around our living room with its mismatched furniture and crayon marks on the walls. "What about our kids? What about us?" She looked at me like I'd just suggested we sacrifice a goat in the backyard. "This doesn't have anything to do with us. It's my body, Grant. My choice. I don't need your permission." And there it was, the line in the sand. The moment when I realized that somewhere along the way, we'd stopped being a team and started being two people who happened to live in the same house and split the electric bill. My chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped a rubber band around my ribs and was slowly twisting it. "Melissa," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "if you do this, it will destroy our marriage. You understand that, right?" She stared at me for a long moment, and I thought maybe, just maybe, she was starting to get it. Maybe she was realizing that carrying another man's baby wasn't exactly the kind of thing you could just add to your weekend to-do list, right between grocery shopping and soccer practice. But then she smiled, and it wasn't the warm smile I'd fallen in love with 8 years ago. It was cold, calculated, like she'd already made up her mind and was just going through the motions of pretending to care about my opinion. "Then maybe," she said, standing up and smoothing down her yoga pants, "you should rethink what being a husband means." And just like that, she walked out of the room, leaving me sitting there with the muted TV and the crushing realization that my marriage had just died, even though neither of us was ready to admit it yet. That was the night everything changed. That was the night I learned that sometimes the person you love most in the world can become a complete stranger without ever leaving the room. You'd think after dropping a nuclear bomb on our marriage, Melissa might have taken a step back to consider the radioactive fallout. But nope, that would have required actual self-awareness, and apparently, my wife had checked that particular skill at the door when she decided to play baby factory for her boss. The next few days were like living in some twisted version of Groundhog Day, except instead of Bill Murray trying to win over Andy McDowell, I was stuck trying to talk sense into a woman who'd apparently lost her damn mind. Every morning, I'd wake up thinking maybe the whole thing had been a nightmare brought on by too much leftover pizza. But there she'd be, humming while she made coffee, acting like she hadn't just announced her plans to destroy our family with the casual enthusiasm of someone discussing their weekend gardening plans. "Melissa," I'd start, because I'm nothing if not persistent, some might say stupidly optimistic. "We need to talk about this surrogate thing." She'd give me this patronizing smile that made me want to throw my coffee mug against the wall. "Grant, I've made up my mind. Charles and Vivian really need this." Charles and Vivian. Always Charles and Vivian, like they were the royal family or something. Never mind that Charles was just another corporate suit who'd probably stepped on a dozen people climbing his way up the ladder. And Vivian was one of those society wives who spent more on handbags than most people made in a year. But sure, let's upend our entire life because they couldn't figure out how to make a baby the old-fashioned way. I tried every angle I could think of. The practical angle. "Mel, you know how miserable you were when you were pregnant with Emma. You couldn't keep anything down for 3 months, and your back was killing you the entire time." The emotional angle. What are the kids going to think when mommy's walking around with someone else's baby? The financial angle. They're not exactly paying you enough to cover the medical bills, let alone compensation for 9 months of your life. But nothing stuck. She had an answer for everything, delivered with the kind of self-righteous certainty that probably started wars back in the day. She'd help with childcare costs. She'd explain to the kids that she was helping a family. She was doing this out of the goodness of her heart, not for money. Although, let's be real, the 25 grand Charles was offering didn't exactly hurt her enthusiasm. Then the flying monkeys showed up. First, it was her sister Clara, because of course it was. Clara had always been jealous of Melissa, jealous of her job, her house, her kids, probably even her split ends if we're being honest. So naturally, when Melissa called to share her brilliant plan, Clara jumped on the supportive sister bandwagon like she was running for political office. The call came on a Thursday night while I was helping Jake with his math homework, trying to remember why algebra was supposed to be important when you grow up to be an accountant who spends his days entering numbers into spreadsheets that nobody reads. Grant. Clara's voice had that fake sweet tone she used when she was about to stick a knife between your shoulder blades. I just wanted to call and tell you how proud I am of Melissa. I pressed the phone harder against my ear, hoping the kids couldn't hear this conversation. Oh yeah? And why's that, Clara? For agreeing to be a surrogate. It's such a selfless, beautiful thing to do. You should be supporting her instead of being so negative about it. Negative. Right. Because apparently, not wanting your wife to carry another man's baby made you the villain in this twisted fairy tale. Clara, with all due respect, this is between Melissa and me. It's really not. She's my sister, Clara interrupted, and I could practically see her getting all puffed up with righteous indignation. And what she's doing is amazing. She's giving the gift of life to people who can't have children. It's practically saintly. Saintly. Jesus Christ. You know what would be saintly, Clara? If Charles and Vivian adopted one of the thousands of kids who need homes instead of paying my wife to manufacture them a custom baby. The line went quiet for a second, and I thought maybe I'd actually gotten through to her. But then she came back swinging. You're being selfish, Grant. This isn't about you. It's about helping people, and Melissa has a big enough heart to do it. Maybe you should try having a little compassion. I wanted to tell Clara exactly where she could stick her compassion, but Jake was sitting right there, chewing on his pencil eraser and probably absorbing every word of this train wreck. So instead, I just said, "Thanks for the call, Clara. I'll keep that in mind," and hung up. But Clara was just the opening act. The real headliner came that Sunday after church, because of course this conversation had to happen after church, where everyone was supposed to be feeling all holy and charitable. Melissa's mother, Joanne, cornered me in the parking lot while Melissa was inside getting the kids from Sunday school. Joanne was one of those women who'd perfected the art of passive-aggressive warfare, who could make you feel like a complete piece of garbage while smiling and offering you a casserole. "Grant, dear," she said, linking her arm through mine like we were old friends instead of two people who barely tolerated each other. "I wanted to have a little chat with you about Melissa's decision." Here we go, I thought. Round 2 of let's all gang up on Grant. "Joanne, I really don't think this is the right place." "Oh, nonsense. There's no wrong place to discuss doing God's work." She patted my arm with her free hand, the same way you'd pat a dog who'd just peed on the carpet. "What Melissa is doing is truly noble. She's bringing life into the world for people who can't do it themselves. You should be proud of her, not trying to hold her back." Noble. There was that word again. Apparently, everyone had gotten the memo that this was the official spin we were putting on the situation. "Joanne, I understand that you think." "I don't think, dear. I know. I raised 3 children, and I know what sacrifice looks like. Melissa is making a beautiful sacrifice, and as her husband, you should be supporting her, not making her feel guilty about doing the right thing." The right thing. The right thing would have been talking to me before she agreed to anything. The right thing would have been considering how this would affect our kids, our marriage, our entire life. But apparently, I was the only one who seemed to think any of that mattered. "Has it occurred to anyone," I said, trying to keep my voice low even though I wanted to shout, "that maybe Melissa should have discussed this with her husband before agreeing to carry another man's baby?" Joanne's smile never wavered, but her grip on my arm tightened. "Marriage is about supporting each other's dreams, Grant, not holding each other back out of selfishness." Selfishness. Right. Because not wanting your family to be turned into a circus sideshow was selfish. Because thinking your wife should prioritize her actual family over her boss's wishes was selfish. That night, after the kids were in bed and Melissa was upstairs taking one of her endless baths, I sat her down at the kitchen table. The same table where we'd eaten thousands of meals, where we'd helped the kids with homework, where we'd planned vacations we couldn't afford and dreamed about a future that was apparently never going to happen. "Melissa," I said, looking directly into her eyes, hoping she could see how serious I was, "I need you to really hear me. If you go through with this surrogate thing, our marriage is over." She stared at me for a long moment, and for just a second, I thought I saw a flicker of uncertainty in her expression. Maybe she was finally starting to understand what was at stake here. Maybe she was realizing that some decisions can't be undone, that some choices change everything. But then her face hardened, and she crossed her arms over her chest like she was building a wall between us. Then maybe, she said, her voice cold enough to freeze hell over, you should rethink what being a husband means. And there it was again, the same line she'd used a few nights ago, delivered with the same icy certainty. Like I was the problem. Like I was the one being unreasonable. That was her ultimatum, delivered with all the warmth of a tax audit. Shape up or ship out. Support her insane plan or get out of her way. Looking back now, I realized that was the moment our marriage officially flatlined. Everything that happened after that was just the long, slow process of pulling the plug. 3 months. 3 goddamn months of walking on eggshells, sleeping in the same bed as someone who'd essentially become a stranger, and pretending everything was normal while my wife went through the motions of getting artificially inseminated with another man's sperm. Yeah, you read that right. Artificially inseminated. Because apparently, even when you're destroying your marriage, there are still medical procedures to follow. During those 3 months, I kept hoping she'd come to her senses. Maybe she'd wake up one morning and realize that carrying her boss's baby wasn't exactly the career move she thought it was. Maybe she'd look at our kids, Jake with his gap-toothed grin, Emma with her stubborn cowlick, and little Sophie who still crawled into our bed during thunderstorms, and remember that she already had a family worth protecting. But hope, as it turns out, is just disappointment wearing a fancy outfit. The morning everything became real started like any other Tuesday in suburban hell. I was downstairs making coffee in our ancient Mr. Coffee machine that made sounds like a dying walrus, but somehow still managed to brew a decent cup when I heard Melissa's footsteps on the stairs. Not her usual rushed morning stomp. She was late for everything, always had been, but slow, deliberate steps, like she was walking to her own execution. Or mine. She appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing that ratty pink bathrobe she'd had since college, the one with the coffee stain on the front that no amount of bleach could remove. Her hair was pulled back in one of those messy buns that women somehow make look effortless but probably takes 20 minutes to achieve, and she was holding something in her hand. A pregnancy test. Because of course she was. Grant, she said, and her voice had this weird mix of excitement and terror that I'd heard twice before, when she'd told me she was pregnant with Jake, and again with Emma. But this time, hearing it made my stomach drop through the floor and probably into our neighbor's basement. I set down my coffee mug, the one Emma had made me in art class with "World's Okayest Dad" painted in crooked letters, and turned to face her fully. Part of me wanted to run, just bolt out the back door, hop in my Honda Civic, and drive until I hit ocean or ran out of gas, whichever came first. But the other part of me, the part that had been preparing for this moment for 3 months, just stood there waiting for the inevitable. It worked, she said, holding up the pregnancy test like it was a winning lottery ticket instead of the death certificate for our marriage. I'm pregnant. And there it was. The moment when theoretical became real, when stupid became irreversible, when my wife officially became pregnant with her boss's baby. She was standing there with this triumphant smile on her face, like she'd just won the Nobel Prize for outstanding achievement in ruining your family. And all I could think was how completely and utterly screwed we were. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I didn't grab her by the shoulders and shake her until she came to her senses. I just looked at her, really looked at her, and said the only thing that made sense anymore. Okay. That's it. Just okay. One word. 4 letters. The period at the end of the sentence that had been our marriage. She blinked at me, clearly expecting some kind of bigger reaction. Maybe she thought I'd suddenly see the light and realize what a beautiful, generous thing she was doing. Maybe she thought I'd break down and beg her to reconsider. Or maybe she thought I'd lose my shit completely and give her the dramatic confrontation she could use to justify everything she'd done. But I didn't give her any of that. I just picked up my coffee, took a sip, and said it again. Okay, that's it? She asked, and now there was confusion creeping into her voice. That's all you have to say? I shrugged, which I know sounds callous, but what else was there to do? We'd already had every conversation worth having about this topic. I'd already told her exactly what would happen if she went through with it. She'd already made it clear that my opinion didn't matter to her. So yeah, okay, pretty much covered it. Melissa, I said, setting my mug down and turning toward the stairs, You made your choice 3 months ago. Now I'm making mine. I went upstairs, got dressed for work, and kissed each of my kids goodbye like it was any other morning. Jake was trying to eat his cereal while simultaneously playing some game on his tablet. Emma was having a meltdown because her favorite shirt was in the dirty laundry, and Sophie was sitting in her high chair painting her face with yogurt. Normal chaos. Beautiful, normal chaos that was about to get a whole lot more complicated. Melissa followed me to the front door, still in that damn bathrobe, still holding the pregnancy test like it was made of gold. "Grant, we need to talk about this," she said, and the desperation in her voice almost made me feel sorry for her. Almost. "No," I said, grabbing my keys from the bowl by the door, the ceramic bowl Emma had made in second grade that was supposed to look like a flower, but mostly looked like something you'd find at the bottom of a pond. "We really don't." And then I left. I drove to work, sat in my cubicle, and spent 8 hours entering numbers into spreadsheets while my marriage imploded in slow motion. Around lunchtime, I pulled out my phone and called James Holloway, a divorce attorney I'd gone to high school with. We'd played on the same baseball team junior year. He was a decent shortstop, terrible at math, and apparently great at destroying marriages for a living. "Jim," I said when he picked up, "it's Grant Walker. I need a lawyer." There was a pause, and then he said, "Jesus, Grant, what did you do?" "It's not what I did," I said, looking around the office to make sure nobody was listening. "It's what my wife did. She's pregnant with her boss's baby." Another pause, longer this time. "Come again?" "She's a surrogate. For her boss and his wife. I told her not to do it. She did it anyway. Now I need to know what my options are." "Holy shit, man. That's wow. Okay, can you come in tomorrow morning? We need to talk about this in person." 2 days later, I had divorce papers drawn up. Professional, clean, no-nonsense divorce papers that laid out exactly what I wanted. Custody of our 3 kids, half the house equity, and absolutely zero responsibility for the baby she was carrying. I had James serve them to her at her office because I figured if she could make major life decisions without consulting me, I could return the favor. She called me that afternoon, sobbing so hard I could barely understand what she was saying. "You can't be serious," she kept repeating, like saying it enough times would somehow make it true. "You can't be serious." But I was serious, dead serious, more serious than I'd ever been about anything in my life. "Melissa," I said, sitting in my car in the parking lot of a Starbucks because I couldn't have this conversation at home with the kids listening. "I told you exactly what would happen if you did this. You didn't believe me. That's not my fault." Even her boss got involved, because apparently, Charles Whitmore thought his money and influence extended to my personal life. He called me that evening, his voice dripping with that fake concern that rich people use when they're pretending to care about the little people. "Grant," he said, and I could practically hear the expensive suit he was wearing. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. What Melissa is doing, what she's doing for Vivian and me, it's a beautiful thing. A gift. You should see this as something to be proud of, not something to run away from. A gift. A beautiful gift." That's what he called the destruction of my marriage. "Mr. Whitmore," I said, using his formal title because screw his first name familiarity. "Let me make something clear. You hired my wife's body to carry your baby. You destroyed my marriage. That makes this your problem, not mine. Handle it." And then I hung up on him, because rich or not, boss or not, he didn't get to lecture me about my own life. That night, lying in bed next to a woman who was carrying another man's child, I realized something important. Betrayal doesn't always come with dramatic music and tear-filled confrontations. Sometimes it comes with a triumphant smile and a pregnancy test, delivered over morning coffee like it's good news instead of the end of everything you thought you knew about your life. You know what's funny about filing for divorce? It doesn't actually make your wife disappear. I mean, I knew that logically. I'm not a complete idiot, but somehow I'd thought that once I served Melissa those papers, she'd magically vanish from my daily life like a bad dream or a telemarketer who finally gets the hint. Instead, she just kept existing in my space, growing another man's baby while acting like nothing had fundamentally changed about our situation. The first few weeks after dropping the divorce bomb were like living in some twisted version of the Twilight Zone. Melissa refused to move out, claiming she needed stability during this difficult time. Apparently, carrying your boss's baby is stressful. Who knew? So we were stuck in this bizarre domestic purgatory where we shared a house, kids, and a mortgage, but absolutely nothing else. She'd set up camp in the guest bedroom, the one we'd always said we'd turn into a home office someday, when we had money and motivation. Now it looked like a nursery showroom had exploded in there, boxes of baby stuff everywhere, a crib that was still in pieces leaning against the wall, and enough prenatal vitamins to supply a small army of pregnant women. The whole room smelled like that weird combination of new plastic and false hope. The worst part wasn't the constant reminder that my wife was playing house with someone else's genetic material. No, the worst part was how she kept acting like I was still her husband, like I was still somehow responsible for taking care of her during her journey. That's what she called it, a journey, like she was climbing Everest instead of just getting knocked up by her boss. Grant, can you grab me some pickles on your way home? She'd text me at work, like I was still running errands for her instead of actively trying to extract myself from her life. Grant, can you help me set up the crib? It's really heavy, and I'm not supposed to lift anything over 10 pounds. Grant, can you drive me to my doctor's appointment? Charles and Vivian are in Europe for 2 weeks. Each time, I'd look at my phone and feel this mixture of disbelief and rage that she still thought I was part of Team Melissa. Did she honestly believe that filing for divorce was just some kind of negotiating tactic? Like I was playing hard to get instead of actually trying to get the hell out of Dodge? My standard response became a masterpiece of emotional detachment. I wouldn't even look up from whatever I was doing, usually my laptop, because work had become my escape from the circus my home life had become. Not my kid, not my problem. 6 words. Simple, direct, and absolutely devastating in their clarity. The first time I said it, Melissa looked like I'd physically slapped her. By the 10th time, she just got this pinched expression around her eyes, like she was developing a permanent migraine from dealing with my unreasonable attitude. But here's the thing about being pregnant. It doesn't care whether your husband has checked out of the relationship or not. Biology doesn't give a damn about your emotional state or your marital status. So while I was busy practicing my emotional detachment, Melissa was dealing with all the fun stuff that comes with growing a human. Morning sickness that lasted all day, weird food cravings that sent her to the grocery store at midnight looking for pickles and ice cream, and the kind of exhaustion that made her fall asleep sitting up watching Netflix. And when things got really tough, when the glamorous reality of being a surrogate mother started to hit her, guess who she turned to for support? Not Charles and Vivian, who were busy living their fabulous rich people life. Not her sister Clara, who was great at cheerleading from a distance, but mysteriously unavailable when actual help was needed. Not her mother Joanne, who'd suddenly developed a case of selective hearing whenever Melissa called asking for assistance. Nope, she turned to me, the guy she'd basically told to go screw himself when he asked her not to carry another man's baby. The pattern was always the same. She'd start out trying to handle everything herself, putting on this brave face like she was some kind of pregnancy warrior who didn't need anybody. But then reality would set in. Usually around 3 a.m. when the baby decided to practice kickboxing on her internal organs, and she'd come knocking on my bedroom door like a lost puppy looking for shelter. Grant, she'd whisper, tapping softly on the door like she was afraid to wake me up, even though we both knew I wasn't sleeping. Who could sleep with all the drama happening under our roof? Grant, are you awake? I'd lie there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to her breathe on the other side of the door. Part of me, the part that had loved her for 8 years, the part that had held her hair back when she had food poisoning, the part that had stayed up all night when she was scared about Jake's ear infection, wanted to open that door and help her. But the bigger part, the part that was still pissed off about her complete disregard for our marriage, kept me glued to the mattress. Please, Grant, just once, can you help me? The baby's kicking so hard I can't sleep, and I'm scared something's wrong. That's when I'd roll over and deliver my favorite new phrase with all the warmth of a tax audit. Not my baby. Not my problem. The silence that followed was always thick enough to cut with a knife. Sometimes she'd stand there for a few minutes, probably hoping I'd change my mind. Sometimes I'd hear her crying softly through the door, which should have broken my heart, but mostly just made me angry. She'd made her choice, and now she was learning that choices have consequences. Even our neighbors started to notice that something was off. Mr. Daniels, the retired guy next door who spent most of his time watering his lawn and judging everyone else's landscaping choices, cornered me one Saturday morning while I was taking out the trash. "Grant," he said, glancing toward our house where Melissa was visible through the kitchen window, moving slowly and looking about as miserable as a human being could look. "Everything okay over there?" "Melissa looks exhausted." I followed his gaze and saw her struggling to reach something in the top cabinet, her pregnant belly making it impossible to get close enough to the counter. 6 months ago, I would have rushed inside to help her. Now, I just shrugged and kept walking toward the garbage cans. "She made her bed," I told Mr. Daniels. "Let her lie in it." He gave me this look like I'd just announced I was joining a cult or starting a meth lab in my garage. "But Grant, she's pregnant. Doesn't matter what happened between you two. She needs help. Then her boss can help her," I said, shoving the trash bag into the can with more force than necessary. "He's the father, not me." Mr. Daniels shook his head like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "I don't know what happened between you two, but this isn't right, son. A man doesn't abandon his wife when she's carrying a child. A wife doesn't get pregnant by another man." I shot back, because I was getting really tired of everyone acting like I was the villain in this story. Charles Whitmore wanted a baby, he got one. Now he can deal with everything that comes with it. But Charles and Vivian, it turned out, were about as useful as screen doors on a submarine when it came to the day-to-day reality of pregnancy. They showed up for the big moments, the ultrasound appointments where they could see their precious baby developing, the doctor visits where they could ask questions about genetic testing and due dates. They brought expensive gifts and talked about nursery themes and college funds. But when Melissa needed someone to hold her hair back while she puked her guts out, or when she needed help getting up from the couch because her center of gravity had shifted to somewhere around Jupiter, Charles and Vivian were nowhere to be found. They had lives to live, after all, important places to be. Charles had board meetings and golf games. Vivian had charity galas and spa appointments. They couldn't be expected to deal with the messy, unglamorous parts of pregnancy. That's what husbands were for. Except I wasn't her husband anymore, not in any way that mattered. I was just the guy who happened to share a house with her while lawyers figured out how to divide up 8 years of marriage into neat little legal categories. I was the roommate who knew where she kept the good ice cream and which brand of prenatal vitamins didn't make her nauseous, but who had absolutely zero interest in using that knowledge to make her life easier. Because here's the thing nobody talks about when they're busy judging your choices. Sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes respect matters more than affection, and sometimes preserving your own sanity is more important than being the bigger person. Melissa had chosen Charles and Vivian's needs over mine, their future over ours, their happiness over our family's stability. Now she could live with the consequences of that choice, all by herself, just like she'd wanted. 9 months. That's how long it takes to grow a human being, destroy a marriage, and completely lose your damn mind. By the time Melissa hit her 3rd trimester, our house had turned into some kind of surreal performance art piece about dysfunction. She'd waddle around like a penguin wearing yoga pants, complaining about everything from her swollen ankles to the baby's habit of using her bladder as a soccer ball, while I perfected the art of being physically present but emotionally checked out. The whole situation was like watching a car accident in slow motion. You know it's going to end badly, but you can't look away because the human brain is wired for disaster porn. Every day brought some new drama, some fresh reminder that my wife was carrying another man's genetic legacy, while I counted down the days until I could legally extract myself from this nightmare. The birth itself happened on a Tuesday in March, because apparently even babies don't have the courtesy to arrive on convenient days. I was at work, deep in the thrilling world of quarterly tax filings, when my phone started buzzing like an angry hornet. The first call was from Melissa, which I let go to voicemail because I'd learned that answering her calls only led to requests for favors I had no intention of granting. The second call was also from Melissa, then the 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Finally, I picked up, figuring maybe the house was on fire or one of our actual kids needed something. "Grant," she gasped, and I could hear that particular brand of panic that meant things were happening fast. "It's time. The baby's coming." For a split second, just one stupid, reflexive second, my brain went into husband mode. The same mode that had kicked in when she'd gone into labor with Jake, Emma, and Sophie. The mode where you drop everything, grab the hospital bag, and drive like a maniac while trying to remember everything from those childbirth classes you'd slept through. But then reality crashed back in like a bucket of ice water. This wasn't my baby. This wasn't my emergency. This was Charles and Vivian's big moment, the culmination of their expensive fertility journey, the answer to all their rich people prayers. Okay, I said, my voice as flat as roadkill. So call Charles. I did, she sobbed, and now I could hear the real fear creeping in. He's in a meeting. His secretary said she'd try to reach him, but then call Vivian. She's at some spa in Napa. Grant, please, I need. I hung up, just pressed the little red button, and went back to my tax forms like nothing had happened. Because what was I supposed to do? Drop everything and rush to the hospital to watch my wife give birth to her boss's baby? Hold her hand while she delivered another man's child? Cut the umbilical cord that connected someone else's kid to my wife's body? Yeah, that was going to be a hard pass for me. The phone kept ringing. Melissa, probably calling from the ambulance or the hospital, desperate for someone, anyone, to be there for her during what should have been one of the most important moments of her life. But she'd made her choice about who mattered to her, and it wasn't me. Around 3 p.m., my desk phone rang. The hospital. Mr. Walker? This is St. Mary's Hospital. Your wife Melissa asked us to call you. She's given birth to a healthy baby boy, and she's asking if you can come. I'm not the father, I said, cutting off whatever guilt trip they were about to lay on me. Call Charles Whitmore. He's the father. This has nothing to do with me. There was a pause, the kind of silence that happens when someone realizes they've stepped into a situation way more complicated than they bargained for. Sir, Mrs. Walker is very upset. She's asking for you specifically. And I'm specifically not coming, I said. Like I told you, call Charles Whitmore. It's his baby, his responsibility. I gave them Charles's office number and hung up, then spent the rest of the day trying to focus on work while ignoring the growing knot in my stomach. Not guilt. I was way past guilt, but something else. Maybe relief that it was finally over, that the pregnancy that had been hanging over our lives like a storm cloud had finally ended. Maybe anticipation for what came next, now that there was an actual baby involved instead of just the abstract idea of one. That evening, I picked up our kids from after-school care like it was any other day. Jake was excited because he'd gotten an A on his science project about volcanoes. Emma was grumpy because some kid had stolen her favorite pencil eraser, and Sophie wanted to know if we could have pancakes for dinner. Normal kid problems. Beautiful, normal kid problems that had nothing to do with surrogacy or bosses or babies that belonged to other people. Where's Mommy? Sophie asked as I buckled her into her car seat. Mommy's at the hospital, I said, which was technically true. She had to help some people today. Is she sick? Emma asked, and I could see her starting to worry in that way kids do when they sense something's wrong but don't understand what. No, sweetheart. She's fine. She just had to do something for work. It wasn't a lie exactly. Melissa had made it pretty clear that this whole surrogate thing was about her career, about impressing Charles and securing her position at the firm. So yeah, it was work-related. We went home, ordered pizza, and had what turned out to be one of the nicest evenings we'd had in months. Without Melissa's pregnancy hormones turning every conversation into a potential minefield, without the constant tension of living with someone who'd fundamentally betrayed everything our marriage was supposed to represent, the house felt peaceful for the first time in 9 months. Around 8 p.m., after the kids were in bed, my phone rang. Melissa, calling from the hospital, her voice thick with exhaustion and something that might have been regret. Grant, she whispered, like she was afraid someone might overhear. Please come. I'm scared. And for just a moment, I felt something crack inside my chest. Not enough to change my mind, but enough to remind me that once upon a time, I'd loved this woman enough to marry her, enough to have 3 kids with her, enough to believe we'd grow old together on some front porch somewhere, watching our grandkids play in the yard. But love isn't always enough. Sometimes it's not even relevant. Call Charles, I said, my voice gentler than it had been in months, but still absolutely final. He's the father, not me. Charles is, he's busy. The baby's beautiful, Grant. He has these tiny little fingers, and he's so perfect, and I need someone here who cares about me. That's when it hit me, the real tragedy of the whole situation. She'd spent 9 months carrying this baby for people who saw her as nothing more than a high-end incubator, and now that the job was done, She was discovering exactly how much they actually cared about her as a person. Charles was busy, probably celebrating with Vivian somewhere expensive, while the woman who'd carried their child lay in a hospital bed, alone and scared, realizing that she'd traded her marriage for people who couldn't even be bothered to show up when she needed them most. But that wasn't my problem anymore. I tried to warn her. I told her exactly what would happen. She'd chosen not to believe me. "Melissa," I said, looking out the kitchen window at our backyard where the kids' swing set sat empty in the fading light. "You made your choice. Now live with it." And then I hung up and turned off my phone, because I was done being her backup plan, done being the person she turned to when her real priorities let her down, done being married to someone who'd put her boss's needs ahead of our family's well-being. The baby was born, healthy and perfect, just like she'd said. Charles and Vivian finally showed up at the hospital with flowers and champagne, and probably a photographer to document their magical moment. They got their custom-made baby, their happy ending, their perfect little family. And I got to start figuring out what my life looked like without the woman who'd been the center of it for 8 years, but who'd chosen to give the most intimate part of herself to someone else. The thing about rock bottom is that it's surprisingly comfortable once you've been there for a while. You'd think it would be this dramatic, soul-crushing experience, but really it's more like settling into a worn-out recliner. Not pleasant, exactly, but familiar enough that you stop noticing how much it sucks. Melissa came home from the hospital 3 days after giving birth, and it was like watching a ghost try to resume its old haunting routine. She moved through the house like she was sleepwalking, clutching that baby like it was the last life preserver on the Titanic, and looking at me with these desperate, hollow eyes that screamed, "Fix this," louder than any words ever could. But here's the thing about being the guy who warned everyone the ship was going to sink. By the time you're proven right, nobody wants to hear, "I told you so." They just want you to somehow magically make everything okay again, like you're some kind of domestic superhero who can undo months of spectacularly bad decisions with the power of forgiveness and selective amnesia. Not happening. The first week was almost funny, in a dark comedy sort of way. Melissa would shuffle around the house in her ratty bathrobe, looking like an extra from a zombie movie, while Charles and Vivian's beautiful gift screamed at all hours of the day and night. Turns out babies don't give a damn about your motivations for having them. They're going to cry whether you're their biological mother or just the lady who happened to carry them for 9 months. She'd set up a makeshift nursery in the guest bedroom, complete with all the baby gear that Charles and Vivian had bought, but apparently couldn't be bothered to take home yet. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here she was, playing house with someone else's kid while our actual children tiptoed around the house like they were afraid to breathe too loud. "Mommy, why is the baby here?" Sophie asked one morning, standing in the kitchen doorway in her favorite pajamas, the ones with unicorns that she insisted had magical powers. "I thought you said he was going to live with other people." Melissa looked like Sophie had just asked her to explain quantum physics in interpretive dance. "Well, sweetheart, sometimes babies need to stay with their birth mommy for a little while before they go to their forever home." Birth mommy. Jesus Christ. She was talking about herself like she was running some kind of baby rental service. Like when we fostered Mr. Whiskers before he went to live with Grandma. Emma piped up, because my 8-year-old apparently had a better grasp on the situation than my wife did. "Something like that," Melissa said, which was probably the most honest thing she'd said in months. But the comparison to our brief stint fostering Joanne's cat was more accurate than Melissa wanted to admit. Because just like with Mr. Whiskers, everyone expected me to help take care of something that wasn't mine and wasn't staying. The bottles started appearing in our sink like some kind of domestic plague. Formula containers cluttered our kitchen counter. Dirty diapers overflowed the garbage can, and our washing machine ran constantly, churning through an endless cycle of tiny clothes and blankets that smelled like that particular combination of baby powder and desperation. And through it all, Melissa kept shooting me these looks, part pleading, part anger, part complete bewilderment that I wasn't stepping up to help her with her noble sacrifice. Like I was failing some test I'd never agreed to take. The breaking point came on a Thursday night, about 2 weeks after she'd brought the baby home. I was in the living room, trying to help Jake with his math homework while the baby screamed bloody murder upstairs, when Melissa appeared at the top of the stairs looking like she'd been through a blender. "Grant," she called down, her voice cracking with exhaustion. Can you please just hold him for 10 minutes? I need to take a shower. I didn't even look up from Jake's algebra worksheet. Not my baby. Not my problem. It was the same response I'd been giving for months, delivered with the same flat tone I'd perfected during our entire pregnancy nightmare. But something about hearing it in that moment, with the baby crying and Melissa looking like she was about to collapse, made it land differently. She came down the stairs slowly, still holding the baby, and I could see her hands shaking. Not from exhaustion, though she was definitely that, but from rage. Pure, undiluted fury that had been building up for weeks. You know what? She said, her voice getting louder with each word. I am so sick of your attitude. You owe me this much. That's when I finally looked up from the homework. Jake was staring at both of us with wide eyes, probably wondering if his parents were about to start throwing furniture at each other. The baby was still screaming, which seemed appropriate for the moment. I owe you? I repeated, standing up slowly because this conversation was clearly going to require my full attention. I owe you what exactly? Support, she screamed, and the baby's crying got even louder, like he was trying to match her energy. I'm your wife. This is your home. You can't just pretend I don't exist. Jake, I said, keeping my voice calm. Go upstairs and play in your room for a while, okay, buddy? He scrambled out of there like his pants were on fire, which was probably the smartest thing anyone had done in our house all week. Once he was gone, I turned back to Melissa and let her have it. All the anger I'd been swallowing for months, all the resentment I'd been choking down, all the hurt I'd been pretending didn't exist, it all came pouring out. Let me tell you what I owe you, I said, my voice deadly quiet. I owe you absolutely nothing. You want to know why? Because you're not my wife anymore. Not in any way that matters. Her face went pale, but I wasn't done. You chose to get pregnant by another man. You chose to carry your boss's baby. You chose his needs over our marriage, his wants over our family, his happiness over everything we'd built together. So no, Melissa, I don't owe you support. I don't owe you help. I don't owe you a goddamn thing. It's not like that, she protested, but her voice was weaker now, like she was starting to realize how deep the hole she'd dug really was. It's exactly like that, I shot back. You want to play house with Charles Whitmore's baby? Fine. But don't expect me to be your backup husband when the real parents can't be bothered to show up. That's when she really lost it. The baby was screaming, she was screaming, and I was standing there watching my marriage finally die its long overdue death. You're abandoning me, she shrieked, like somehow I was the villain in this story. How can you be so cruel? I'm not abandoning you, I said, grabbing my keys from the counter because I needed to get out of there before I said something I'd actually regret. I'm just refusing to clean up your mess anymore. Where are you going? She demanded. Anywhere but here, I said, heading for the door. Call Charles. Call Vivian. Call your sister, your mother. Call the Pope for all I care. But stop calling me. I'm done. And then I left, got in my car and drove around for 2 hours, listening to talk radio and trying to remember what my life had been like before it turned into a soap opera written by someone with serious mental health issues. When I came back, the house was quiet. Melissa's car was gone, and so was the baby. She'd finally packed up and left, taking her beautiful gift with her. For the first time in months, I could hear myself think. For the first time in almost a year, my house felt like home again instead of a war zone. The kids were upstairs, probably confused and scared by all the yelling, but safe. Our actual children, the ones who mattered, the ones I'd been trying to protect through this whole nightmare. I made them mac and cheese for dinner, the good stuff from the box, not the fancy organic kind Melissa always insisted on, and we ate in front of the TV like we were having an indoor picnic. Nobody mentioned the baby. Nobody asked where Mommy went. They just seemed relieved that the constant crying had stopped and the house felt normal again. That night, after I tucked them all in and made sure they knew they were safe and loved, I sat in my kitchen and realized something important. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their self-destruction. Melissa had made her choice. Now she could live with it. You know what they say about peace and quiet, it never lasts long enough. For exactly 2 blissful days after Melissa packed up her baby drama and left, my house felt like an actual home again. The kids and I fell into this easy rhythm where we could eat cereal for dinner without judgment, watch cartoons without someone sighing dramatically about screen time, and generally exist without walking on eggshells around a woman who'd spent the last year making everyone else's life miserable. But apparently, the universe has a sick sense of humor, because just when I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could get through this divorce without any more insanity, the flying monkeys descended. It started with my voicemail inbox lighting up like a Christmas tree. I'd come home from work to find 7 new messages, each one more ridiculous than the last. It was like Melissa had sent out some kind of emergency alert to every person who'd ever met her. Attention, all friends and family members. Grant is being mean to me. Please call and tell him he's a terrible person. The first message was from her sister Clara, because of course it was. Clara had apparently appointed herself as the head of the Grant is obviously Satan committee, and she was taking her new job very seriously. Grant. Her voice came through my phone speaker with all the warmth of a tax audit. I cannot believe what Melissa told me. She's sitting in my living room right now, crying her eyes out because her own husband abandoned her with a newborn baby. How can you be so heartless? She's your wife, Grant. Your wife. Where is your sense of responsibility? I had to laugh at that one. Responsibility. Right. Because apparently, I was responsible for taking care of a baby that wasn't mine, born as a result of a decision I'd explicitly opposed, for people who couldn't be bothered to handle their own parenting duties. That made perfect sense in Clara's twisted little world. The next message was from Melissa's college roommate, some woman named Jennifer who I'd met exactly twice in 8 years of marriage, but who apparently felt qualified to judge my entire character based on whatever sob story Melissa had fed her. Grant, this is Jennifer Morrison, Melissa's friend from college. I just wanted to say that I think what you're doing is absolutely disgusting. Melissa is going through the hardest time of her life, and instead of supporting her, you're being selfish and cruel. She gave that couple the most precious gift anyone can give, and you're punishing her for it. I hope you can live with yourself. The most precious gift. Jesus Christ, they were all reading from the same script. Like carrying your boss's baby was some kind of humanitarian effort instead of a spectacularly bad career move that destroyed a marriage. But the real masterpiece came from her mother, Joanne, who'd apparently been saving up her passive-aggressive energy for one devastating voicemail that lasted nearly 5 minutes. Grant, dear, she began, using that saccharine tone she always used when she was about to gut you with surgical precision. I just got off the phone with my daughter, and I have to say, I'm deeply disappointed in you. Deeply disappointed. When Melissa married you, I thought she was getting a man who would stand by her through thick and thin, for better or worse. But apparently, I was wrong. She paused there, probably for dramatic effect, before launching into the main course of her guilt trip. That poor girl is sitting in Clara's apartment right now with a beautiful baby boy, and she's heartbroken because the man she married, the man who promised to love and honor her, has turned his back on her in her hour of need. She's exhausted, she's scared, and she's dealing with all of this alone because you've decided to be petty and vindictive instead of being the husband she needs. Petty and vindictive. That's what Joanne called my refusal to play house with my wife's boss's baby. Not principled. Not self-respecting. Petty and vindictive. I raised 3 children, Grant, and I know what sacrifice looks like. What Melissa did. Carrying a child for a couple who couldn't have their own. That's the kind of selfless act that should make a husband proud, not angry. The fact that you can't see that says more about your character than hers. The voicemail went on for another 2 minutes, covering everything from my supposed lack of Christian values to my failure as a role model for our children. By the end of it, I was half convinced that I was indeed the Antichrist, and Melissa was some kind of modern-day saint who'd been unfairly persecuted for her noble deeds. But the absolute cherry on top of this shit Sunday came the next evening when my phone rang during dinner. I was helping Sophie cut up her chicken nuggets when Charles Whitmore's name appeared on my caller ID. Charles fucking Whitmore. The man who'd hired my wife's reproductive system was calling to lecture me about my attitude. The balls on this guy could have been registered as their own small country. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. I had to hear what this pompous ass had to say for himself. Grant, he said when I picked up, his voice dripping with that fake concern that rich people use when they're slumming it with the little people. I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from Melissa. Of course he did. Because apparently, my soon-to-be ex-wife was just handing out my personal information to anyone who asked. What can I do for you, Charles? I asked, putting him on speaker so I could continue helping Sophie with her dinner. If he was going to waste my time, he could at least provide some entertainment for the kids. Well, I wanted to talk to you about this situation with Melissa and the baby. I think there's been a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding, right? Like I'd somehow misunderstood the part where my wife got pregnant with his kid. I'm not sure what you think I'm misunderstanding, I said, cutting up Emma's nuggets while she made faces at the phone. Seems pretty straightforward to me. Grant, what Melissa has done for Vivian and me, it's incredible. It's a gift beyond measure. She's given us the chance to have a family, to experience the joy of parenthood that we thought was lost to us forever. You should be proud of her. You should be supporting her through this transition. Transition. Like carrying someone else's baby was some kind of career change instead of a marriage-ending betrayal. Charles, I said, wiping barbecue sauce off Sophie's face. Let me explain something to you. You hired my wife to carry your baby. You destroyed my marriage. You got what you paid for. Now it's your responsibility to deal with the consequences. There was a pause, and I could practically hear him trying to figure out how to spin this in his favor. But Grant, you're still part of this family. We're all connected now through this beautiful child. We need to work together, support each other. That's when I lost it. Because this asshole, this rich, entitled piece of garbage who'd treated my wife like a rental womb, was trying to tell me that I was part of his family now. Like his money gave him the right to reorganize my entire life to suit his convenience. Listen to me very carefully, Charles, I said, my voice getting deadly quiet. We are not family. We are not connected. We are not anything. You wanted a baby, you got one. You hired my wife's body and destroyed my marriage in the process. But here's the thing. That makes this your problem, not mine. Grant, I don't think you understand. No, I understand perfectly. You thought you could buy your way into parenthood without dealing with any of the messy parts. Well, congratulations. Those messy parts include middle-of-the-night feedings, diaper changes, and a woman who's probably realizing that being a surrogate isn't quite the glamorous experience she thought it would be. But that's your mess to clean up, not mine. But Melissa needed to think about what she was doing before she did it. I interrupted. She needed to consider how this would affect her actual family before she agreed to carry your baby. She needed to listen to her husband when he told her this was a terrible idea. But she didn't do any of those things, did she? The line went quiet, and for a moment I thought maybe I'd actually gotten through to him. Maybe he was starting to understand that his money couldn't buy him absolution from the chaos he'd helped create. But then he came back with that same smooth, condescending tone. Grant, I think you're being unreasonable. This is about more than just you and Melissa. There's a child involved now. Your child, I said, cutting him off again. Your responsibility. Your problem. I never wanted any part of this arrangement. I told everyone it was a bad idea, and now I'm supposed to clean up the mess? I don't think so. And then I hung up on him, because rich or not, boss or not, he didn't get to lecture me about responsibility while sitting in his fancy office, completely removed from the reality of what he'd set in motion. That night, after the kids were in bed, I sat in my kitchen and marveled at the sheer audacity of these people. They'd all rallied around Melissa like she was some kind of victim instead of a woman who'd made a series of spectacularly bad choices that had predictable consequences. Not one of them had called to ask how I was doing. Not one had acknowledged that maybe, just maybe, I had a right to be angry about my wife carrying another man's baby. Not one had suggested that perhaps Melissa should have considered her husband's feelings before agreeing to this insane arrangement. But they all had plenty to say about my supposed failures as a husband and human being. The begging parade was in full swing, and I was apparently the only one who could see how ridiculous the whole thing was. If you've never been through a divorce, let me paint you a picture. Imagine the worst job interview of your life, crossed with a root canal, sprinkled with the emotional devastation of watching your entire adult life get dissected by strangers in cheap suits. Now multiply that by about 1,000, and you're getting close to what it's like to sit in a courtroom while lawyers argue over who gets to keep the good dinnerware and whether you're a terrible human being. The whole thing started 6 months after I'd filed the papers, because apparently the legal system moves at roughly the same speed as continental drift. By the time we actually made it to court, Melissa had settled into her new life as a single mother living in her sister's spare bedroom. Charles and Vivian had presumably bonded with their custom-made baby, and I'd gotten comfortable with the idea that my marriage was deader than disco. But Melissa, being Melissa, couldn't just sign the papers and move on with her life. No, she had to turn our divorce into some kind of three-ring circus, where she was the tragic heroine and I was the mustache-twirling villain who'd abandoned his pregnant wife in her hour of need. Her lawyer was this guy named Richard Steinberg, one of those slick operators who probably learned his trade watching reruns of LA Law and figured out that righteous indignation pays better than actual legal knowledge. He had perfectly styled hair, a tan that definitely came from a bottle, and the kind of practiced sincerity that made you want to check your wallet after shaking his hand. My lawyer, on the other hand, was James Holloway, the same guy I played baseball with in high school, who'd gone on to law school while I was studying accounting and probably wondering why anyone would voluntarily choose a career that involved this much paperwork. Jim was the kind of lawyer who wore off-the-rack suits and actually cared about winning cases instead of just looking good while losing them. The courtroom itself looked exactly like every courtroom you've ever seen on TV, with paneling that had probably been installed during the Coolidge administration, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like they were suffering from a vitamin deficiency, and that particular smell that all government buildings seem to have, like disinfectant mixed with broken dreams. Melissa sat at the plaintiff's table looking like she'd stepped out of a tragic single-mother photo shoot. She was wearing this simple black dress that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. Her hair was pulled back in a style that said, "I'm too devastated to care about my appearance, but somehow still look perfect." And she had this expression on her face like she was bravely enduring an unthinkable injustice. Behind her, in the gallery, sat her entire support squad. Clara looking appropriately outraged, Joan dabbing at her eyes with a tissue like she was watching a particularly sad episode of This Is Us, and, I shit you not, Charles and Vivian Whitmore, sitting in the back row like they were attending a community theater production of Poor Melissa Gets Screwed Over by Her Mean Husband. The audacity of those two showing up was almost impressive. Here they were, the people who'd started this whole mess by hiring my wife's reproductive system, sitting in my divorce proceedings like concerned family members instead of the home-wrecking assholes they actually were. Steinberg opened with what I can only describe as a masterclass in emotional manipulation. He painted a picture of Melissa as this selfless saint who'd made the ultimate sacrifice to help a childless couple, only to be cruelly abandoned by her heartless husband during the most vulnerable time of her life. "Your Honor," he said, gesturing toward Melissa like she was some kind of religious icon, "my client is a woman who exemplifies the very best of human nature. When she learned that her employer and his wife were struggling with infertility, she made the extraordinary decision to serve as their surrogate mother. This wasn't a decision she made lightly, Your Honor. This was an act of pure compassion, a gift of life itself. A gift of life." Jesus, these people really were all reading from the same script. But instead of supporting his wife during this difficult time, Steinberg continued, his voice getting more dramatic with each word. The defendant chose to abandon her. He filed for divorce while she was pregnant, Your Honor. He refused to attend the birth of the child she was carrying. He has shown a callous disregard for his wife's emotional and physical well-being that is frankly shocking. He went on like that for 20 minutes, painting me as some kind of monster who'd kicked a pregnant woman to the curb for having the audacity to help people in need. By the time he was done, I was half convinced that I should be locked up for crimes against humanity instead of just trying to get out of a marriage that had turned into a nightmare. But then it was Jim's turn, and that's when things got interesting. "Your Honor," Jim said, standing up with a stack of papers that looked thick enough to stop a bullet. "The plaintiff's attorney has told you a very compelling story. It's just too bad that story has almost nothing to do with the facts of this case." He walked over to the evidence table and picked up a manila folder that looked like it could have contained the secrets of the universe. "The facts, Your Honor, are these. Mrs. Walker made a unilateral decision to carry another man's child without consulting her husband. When Mr. Walker expressed his opposition to this arrangement, she ignored him. When he explained how this decision would affect their marriage, she dismissed his concerns. And when he told her explicitly that proceeding with this surrogacy would end their marriage, she chose to proceed anyway." Jim opened the folder and pulled out what looked like a phone bill on steroids. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit into evidence a series of text messages between the plaintiff and her sister in which she admits that her husband was opposed to the surrogacy from the beginning. I'd also like to submit several email exchanges between the plaintiff and her employer, Mr. Whitmore, in which she discusses the surrogacy arrangement without ever mentioning her husband's objections. Steinberg jumped up like his chair was on fire. Objection, Your Honor. These communications are privileged. Overruled, the judge said, looking like he was already tired of this case, and it had barely started. Continue, Mr. Holloway. Jim smiled the way a shark smiles when it spots a wounded seal. Your Honor, these communications clearly show that Mrs. Walker was fully aware of her husband's position on this matter. In one text message to her sister, she explicitly states, and I quote, "Grant is being such a baby about this. It's my body, my choice. He doesn't get a vote." I watched Melissa's face go pale as Jim read that text out loud. Apparently, she'd forgotten about her little sister-to-sister honesty session. Furthermore, Your Honor, I'd like to submit a recording of a conversation between Mr. and Mrs. Walker, in which Mr. Walker clearly states that if she proceeds with the surrogacy, their marriage will be over. Mrs. Walker's response, and again I quote, was, "Then maybe you should rethink what being a husband means." The judge looked up from his notes with the expression of a man who'd just realized he was dealing with something way more complicated than a standard divorce case. Mr. Holloway, are you suggesting that your client warned his wife about the consequences of her actions? That's exactly what I'm suggesting, Your Honor. Mr. Walker made his position crystal clear from the beginning. He told his wife that carrying another man's child would destroy their marriage. She chose to ignore that warning. The dissolution of this marriage is the direct result of Mrs. Walker's decision to prioritize her employer's needs over her husband's clearly stated concerns. Steinberg tried to recover, arguing that a husband should support his wife's decisions regardless of his personal feelings, but the damage was done. The texts, the emails, the recorded conversation, it all painted a picture of a woman who'd made a unilateral decision to destroy her marriage and was now shocked that her husband had actually followed through on his warnings. The best part was watching Charles and Vivian squirm in their seats as it became increasingly clear that their beautiful gift had come at the cost of someone else's family. They'd probably thought they were just hiring a surrogate, not destroying a marriage, but intent doesn't really matter when the results speak for themselves. By the time the proceedings wrapped up for the day, it was pretty clear which way the wind was blowing. Melissa looked like she'd been hit by a truck. Her legal dream team looked like they were already planning their exit strategy, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months: hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, the truth would actually matter in this circus. Hope that someone would finally acknowledge that I wasn't the villain in this story, just a guy who tried to protect his marriage and been ignored. Hope that when this was all over, I could finally move on with my life and stop being defined by my wife's spectacularly bad decisions. 2 weeks after the courtroom circus ended, I found myself sitting in the same uncomfortable wooden chair, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. Instead of the tense drama of competing narratives, there was just the cold, hard reality of legal consequences being handed down by a judge who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on the planet. Judge Morrison was one of those old-school guys who'd probably seen every sob story, every excuse, and every attempt at emotional manipulation that the legal system had to offer. He had gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the expression of a man who'd stopped being surprised by human stupidity sometime around the Clinton administration. After reviewing all the evidence presented, he began, his voice carrying the weight of finality that only comes from years of making decisions that change people's lives forever. This court finds that the dissolution of this marriage was the direct result of unilateral decisions made by the plaintiff without regard for her spouse's clearly stated objections. I felt something loosen in my chest, something that had been wound tight for almost a year. This was it. This was the moment when someone in authority finally acknowledged that I wasn't the bad guy in this story. Furthermore, Judge Morrison continued, the court finds that the plaintiff's decision to prioritize her employment obligations over her marital responsibilities demonstrates a fundamental disregard for the stability required to maintain a healthy family environment. Melissa sat at her table looking like someone had just told her that Santa Claus wasn't real and the Easter Bunny was a fraud. Her perfectly composed, tragic mother facade was cracking around the edges, and I could see the panic starting to creep in as she realized that her sob story wasn't going to get her what she wanted. Therefore, this court awards primary physical custody of the minor children, Jacob Walker, Emma Walker, and Sophie Walker, to the defendant, Grant Walker. The plaintiff will be granted supervised visitation rights, to be exercised at times and locations to be determined by the court-appointed mediator. Supervised visitation. That was the legal way of saying, we don't trust you to be alone with your own kids, without someone watching to make sure you don't screw up their lives any worse than you already have. The gavel came down with a sound like a gunshot, and just like that, it was over. 9 months of pregnancy drama, 6 months of legal warfare, and years of marriage. All of it officially dead and buried in about 10 minutes of judicial pronouncement. Melissa broke down completely. Not the pretty, dignified crying you see in movies, but the ugly, desperate sobbing of someone who just realized that actions have consequences and lawyers can't always fix stupid decisions. Her sister Clara rushed forward to comfort her, shooting me a look that could have melted steel, like somehow I was responsible for the mess Melissa had made of her own life. I don't want to lose them, Melissa whispered through her tears, loud enough for everyone in the courtroom to hear. It was probably meant to be one last appeal to my non-existent sympathy, one final attempt to make me the villain for enforcing the natural consequences of her choices. I stood up, straightened my tie, the good one I'd bought specifically for this occasion, and looked down at the woman who'd once been my partner in everything. Then you should have thought about that before you decided to carry another man's baby, I said, my voice calm and steady. You should have thought about them when Charles asked you to be his surrogate. You should have thought about them when I told you this would destroy our family. But you didn't think about them, did you? You thought about yourself. Her crying got louder, more desperate, but I wasn't done. You want to keep seeing our kids? Then show up for them. Be the mother they deserve instead of the woman who traded their family stability for her boss's approval. Prove that they matter more to you than your career ambitions or your need to impress people who don't give a damn about you. I picked up my briefcase, the same one I'd carried to work every day for 8 years, back when I thought I was building a life with someone who shared my priorities, and headed for the door. But understand this, Melissa, I said, turning back for one last look at the mother of my children. I won't let you drag them into your mess. I won't let you use them as emotional support animals while you figure out how to live with the consequences of your choices. They deserve better than that. They deserve a parent who puts them first. Outside the courthouse, the September air felt crisp and clean, like the world had been washed by rain even though the sky was perfectly clear. Jim walked beside me, probably savoring his victory but smart enough not to gloat about it. You did the right thing, Grant, he said as we reached our cars. Those kids need stability, and Melissa's proven she's not capable of providing that right now. I nodded, but I wasn't thinking about being right or wrong. I was thinking about Jake, Emma, and Sophie, waiting for me at home with the babysitter, probably wondering why Daddy had to go to court again and when things would finally get back to normal. For the first time in almost a year, I had an answer for them. Things were going to get back to normal starting right now. No more drama, no more chaos, no more wondering whether the woman who was supposed to be their mother would make another decision that would turn their world upside down. Just me and them, building something stable and sane from the wreckage of what used to be our family. It wasn't the happy ending I'd imagined when I'd first gotten married, but it was better than the alternative. It was a chance for all of us to start over, to build something new without the constant threat of someone else's bad decisions destroying everything we cared about. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my kitchen on a Saturday morning, watching Jake attempt to make pancakes while Emma argues with Sophie about whether syrup belongs on scrambled eggs. The house smells like coffee and slightly burned batter. The morning light is streaming through windows that actually stay clean now that nobody's crying on them constantly. And for the first time in what feels like forever, everything is exactly as chaotic as it should be. This is what normal looks like. Not the fake, Instagram-perfect normal that people pretend to have, but real normal. The kind where your 8-year-old puts too much vanilla in the pancake mix. Your 6-year-old insists that purple is a perfectly reasonable color for breakfast food. And your 4-year-old tries to feed pancakes to the dog we don't have. Dad, can we get a dog? Sophie asks, right on cue, because apparently my kids have developed telepathic powers. Ask me again when you can remember to put your clothes in the hamper instead of on the floor. I tell her, which is parents speak for, not until you're 30 and living in your own house. The funny thing about divorce is that everyone expects you to be miserable. They expect you to be bitter, lonely, struggling to figure out how to braid your daughter's hair, or explain why mommy doesn't live here anymore. And sure, there were some rough patches, like the night Emma asked if mommy stopped loving us, or when Jake's teacher called because he'd been acting out at school. But mostly it's been peaceful, quiet in a good way. Like when you finally turn off a TV that's been playing static in the background for so long you forgot it was even on. The kids have their routine now. School, homework, dinner that doesn't come with a side of drama. Weekend movies where nobody sighs dramatically about screen time. Bedtime stories that don't get interrupted by phone calls from people wanting to discuss the moral implications of my abandonment of a woman who chose another man's baby over her own family. Melissa still calls sometimes. Usually when she's run out of money, discovered that Charles and Vivian aren't quite as generous with their beautiful gift provider as they were during the pregnancy, or realized that being a single mom living in her sister's spare bedroom isn't quite the empowering experience she thought it would be. Grant, I know we've had our differences, but could you help me out with the electric bill? Just this once. Grant, the baby's been crying all night, and I don't know what to do. Charles said they're too busy to help this week. Grant, I made a mistake. I see that now. Can we talk about working things out? The answer is always the same. No, not because I'm trying to be cruel, but because I learned something important during this whole nightmare. You can't save people from the consequences of their own choices. You can't love someone into making better decisions. And you definitely can't build a stable life with someone who's willing to torch everything you've built together for the approval of people who see her as nothing more than a means to an end. Her choices are her burden now, not mine. The kids see her every other weekend, supervised visits at a neutral location because the court decided she needed to prove she could prioritize their well-being over her own drama. Sometimes she shows up, sometimes she doesn't. The kids have learned not to get their hopes up too high, which breaks my heart, but also makes me proud of how resilient they are. Dad, Emma says, interrupting my thoughts. Jake put eggshells in the pancakes. Did not. Jake protests. That's just texture. Gross texture. Sophie adds helpfully. I look at my 3 kids, my actual kids, the ones I chose to protect when their mother chose something else, and feel something I haven't felt in a long time. Contentment. Not happiness exactly, because this isn't how I thought my life would turn out, but contentment with the knowledge that I did the right thing, even when it was hard. All right, troops, I say, standing up to survey the pancake disaster. Let's start over. And this time, maybe we leave the eggshells out of the recipe. Can we put chocolate chips in instead? Sophie asks. Absolutely. I say, because life's too short for plain pancakes and too precious to waste on people who don't appreciate what they have. Outside, it's starting to rain, but inside our house, our actual home now, not just the place where we used to live, it's warm and safe and exactly where we belong. Not my baby, not my problem, but these kids, this life we're building together, this peace we've found in the aftermath of someone else's spectacularly bad decisions, this is all mine, and I'm never letting anyone take it away from us again.